There's a chateau in the Seine Valley, west of Paris, with a chalk cliff behind it and a terrace that looks down over the river. In the summer of 1944, it held the headquarters of Army Group B. The maps were in the ground floor rooms. The signals traffic came in through a switchboard that connected the place to Normandy, to East Prussia, and to Berlin. On the evening we are concerned with, the man reading those signals held two commands at once, and he had held the second of them for 3 days. Far to the east, on the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin, there's a courtyard inside a gray stone office block built for the Imperial Navy. That building housed the headquarters of the replacement army. From about 1645 hours, its teleprinter room began pushing out orders under the code word Valkyrie, and those orders took roughly 3 hours to reach every recipient across the occupied territories. One of the recipients was the chateau in the Seine Valley. Between those two buildings, for about 6 hours, ran a question with only 2 possible answers. In Berlin, a group of officers had declared that Adolf Hitler was dead and that the Wehrmacht had a new commander-in-chief. In the Seine Valley, the senior German soldier in the West had to decide whether to believe them and then whether to act as though he did. He had already been asked. 11 days earlier, on July 9th, the day the British and Canadians moved into Caen, a Luftwaffe Reserve lieutenant colonel had driven out from Paris to put the question to him privately. Antony Beevor records that visit in D-Day, the Battle for Normandy, and he records the follow-up 8 days after that, when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and Field Marshal Günther von Kluge met on July 12th to discuss, in Beevor's words, the military situation and the political consequences. So when the teleprinter began to chatter, nothing about the question was new to Kluge. What was new was that it had stopped being hypothetical. By 40 hours that night, he knew the answer to the first part. Hitler was alive. What he did in the hours on either side of that message, and what he said to the man who drove out to the chateau to make him commit, is the subject of this script. 2 headquarters, 1 decision, and a set of accounts that do not agree with each other, which is where the interesting part starts. Take Kluge first, because his position that night was structurally strange and almost nobody explains it properly. Hans Gnther von Kluge was born on October 30th, 1882, which made him 61 years old in July 1944. He was commissioned as a lieutenant in 1901. He reached general major on February 1st, 1933, as inspector of signals. He reached General der Artillerie on August 1st, 1936, General Oberst on October 1st, 1939, and General Feldmarschall on July 19th, 1940, as one of 12 officers promoted to Field Marshal in a single ceremony after the defeat of France. From December 19th, 1941, he commanded Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. Then, in the summer of 1944, he was sent west, and this is where the reference literature splits. Martin Blumenson, in Breakout and Pursuit, the volume of the United States Army in World War II series covering the Normandy campaign, dates Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's relief from Commander-in-Chief West to July 2nd, 1944. Rundstedt had telephoned Wilhelm Keitel and said he did not feel up to the increased demands. Blumenson notes that Hitler read that as a request for relief, an admission of defeat, or an expression of disagreement, and acted on it. 2 days later, on July 4th, Hitler also relieved General der Panzertruppen Leo Freiherr Geyer von Schweppenburg from Panzer Group West for initiating a report that criticized what Blumenson calls the tactical patchwork in the West. Kluge replaced Rundstedt. English-language reference works date his assumption of Commander-in-Chief West to July 2nd, the same day as Rundstedt's relief. German reference works date it to July 7th. I have not been able to reconcile those two, and I am not going to pick one for you. What is not in dispute is that by the middle of the month he held the post, then Rommel was strafed. On July 17th, 1944, returning from the headquarters of 1st SS Panzer Corps, Rommel's car was attacked from the air near Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. He was thrown from the vehicle and sustained 3 skull fractures. He was given first aid at Livarot. Which pilot did it has never been settled. The attribution splits between Charlie Fox, Jacques Remlinger, and Johannes Jacobus Leroux, and the accounts that name Leroux put him in a Spitfire of 602nd Squadron of the Royal Air Force. Pick your version. The relevant point is the consequence. Army Group B now had no commander. Kluge took it. The command list for Army Group B gives July 17th. The English-language biographical entry on Kluge gives July 19th. Either way, for the first time in the campaign, one man held both Commander-in-Chief West and the Army Group actually fighting the battle in Normandy. And he had held the second job for either 3 days or 1 day when the teleprinter in Berlin started running. That is the structural oddity. On July 20th, 1944, There was no second field marshal in the West to consult, to be overruled by, or to hide behind. The theater command and the fighting command had collapsed into one chair, and the man in it had been in the theater for barely a fortnight. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of research is worth showing to more people. Now the other man. Carl-Heinrich von Stülpnagel was born on January 2nd, 1886, in Berlin, which made him 58. He was commissioned in 1906. He reached General Major on October 1st, 1935, and took the 30th Infantry Division at Lübeck the following year. He reached General Lieutenant on October 1st, 1937, and became Deputy Chief of the General Staff from August 27th of that year. He reached General der Infanterie on April 20th, 1939. That is his rank on the night in question, and it matters, because popular accounts routinely demote him to Lieutenant General, and the American reader hears that as a rank 2 steps below where he actually stood. He commanded 17th Army from December 20th, 1940, through the first months of Barbarossa, leaving that command in the autumn of 1941. Then, on February 13th, 1942, he became Militär Befehlshaber in Frankreich, military commander in France, succeeding his own cousin Otto von Stülpnagel in the post. The German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin dates the appointment to the middle of 1942, rather than to February. And I note the difference rather than smoothing it over. The title needs unpacking, because the whole shape of the night depends on it. Militär Befehlshaber in Frankreich was not a field command, it was the occupation administration. Stülpnagel ran the German military government of occupied France, its territorial troops, its prisons, and its reprisal apparatus. The scholarship on that administration, above all Ulrich Meyer's study of the German occupation of France from 1940 to 1944 and its combination of counterinsurgency and persecution, deals with an office that made policy in writing and had the troops to enforce it. And the record of that office includes this. The German Resistance Memorial Center states plainly that Stülpnagel ordered hostage executions in France before that authority passed to the higher SS and police leader. That is not a footnote to his file. It is his file, alongside everything else in it, and it sits in this script exactly where the promotion dates sit, as record. What the office gave him on July 20th was troops in Paris and a police machine he could reach out and close his hand around. His chief of staff from April 1944 was Oberst Hans Ottfried von Linstow. His personal advisor on the administration's iron and steel section was Oberstleutnant der Reserve Caesar von Hoffacker of the Luftwaffe, a relative of Klaus von Stauffenberg, and the working link between the Paris group and the Bendlerstrasse. The military commandant of Greater Paris was General Lieutenant Hans Freiherr von Boyneburg-Lengsfeld. The troops available for the night's work were Security Regiment 1 of the 325th Security Division. That is a complete set of instruments for taking a capital city off the SS in one night. What it did not include was a single fighting formation and no authority whatsoever over the Normandy front. For anything beyond the boulevards of Paris, Stülpnagel needed the man in the chateau. What Hoffacker carried between Paris and Berlin was not only messages, it was an assessment. Heinemann records the substance of what he reported to Stauffenberg, that the invasion front would hold for at most 2 more weeks before the Allies broke out of it. That is the argument the Paris group was making to Berlin in the middle of July, and it was an operational argument rather than a political one. Act now, because in a fortnight there will be no front left to bargain with. Heinemann is also blunt about the thing everyone wants this story to contain. He argues that Rommel had no knowledge in advance of Stauffenberg's assassination plans, notwithstanding his discussions with his own officers about ending the war and his contact with Hoffacker. And he makes the command point that settles the counterfactual. Rommel was subordinate to Kluge. Independent action by the commander of Army Group B was not structurally available, even before a fighter aircraft removed him from the equation. Which is the duel. One man held the guns and no legitimacy. The other held the legitimacy and would not point it anywhere. The day began, as far as the West was concerned, with nothing at all. At 12:42 hours, local time, a bomb went off in a wooden briefing hut at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia. Nobody in France knew that for hours, and the reason is worth stating precisely, because it shaped everything that followed. The conspirators' communications plan depended on cutting the Wolfschanze off from the rest of the Reich, and then filling the silence with their own signals. The cutoff was partial, and the silence was short. What reached the outside world in the first 2 hours was rumor moving faster than orders. The first thing that reached the Western Command was one of those rumors. Antony Beaver puts it at about 1,500 hours. General der Infanterie Gnther Blumentritt, the chief of staff for Commander-in-Chief West, received word that Hitler had been killed and tried to reach his own commander. He could not. Kluge was out visiting the Normandy front. Hold that for a moment, because it is the hinge of the entire evening, and it is almost always skipped. At the hour when the coup needed the senior soldier in the West at a telephone, he was in a staff car somewhere in the Normandy battle area, and the chief of staff who was trying to find him did not know why the call mattered. In Paris, the news arrived by a different route, and with a name attached to it. At roughly 1600 hours at the Hotel Majestic, the headquarters of the military commander in Paris, Hoffacker took a telephone call from Berlin. That timing comes from popular magazine accounts, rather than from a scholarly reconstruction, and I flag it as such, but the substance is not in dispute across any version. Somebody in the Bendlerstrasse told the Paris group that the attempt had been made. Some accounts have Hoffacker told outright that Hitler was dead. Some have him told the explosion was massive and the putsch was underway, and the government quarter in Berlin was being occupied, which is a materially different message. The distinction matters. It is the difference between a report of a death and a report of an attempt, and everything the Paris group did that night was staked on which of those two things they thought they had heard. In Berlin, the machine was already turning over. Stauffenberg's aircraft came into Rangsdorf at about 15:45 hours. He reached the Bendler block at about 16:30. At about 16:45, the teleprinter room began transmitting the Valkyrie orders, and the transmission of that traffic to every headquarters in the Reich and the occupied territories took roughly 3 hours to complete. The coup's whole timetable was therefore hostage to a teleprinter queue, and the counter-orders were going to arrive on the same wires. Before they arrived, the conspiracy destroyed its own cover with a telephone. General Oberst Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the replacement army in whose name the Valkyrie orders had gone out, wanted reassurance. He rang Keitel at the Wolfschanze and asked him directly whether Hitler was dead. Keitel told him Hitler was alive, and then asked Fromm where Stauffenberg was. That question, and the fact that Fromm was the man being asked it, told the Supreme Command inside a single call which building in Berlin the conspiracy was operating out of. Everything that happened in Paris after that hour was being organized against a headquarters that had already been located. The counter-orders came anyway. Between 1828 and 1842 hours, the Deutschlandsender broadcast that an attempt had been made on Hitler's life and that he had survived with light injuries. Any German staff officer with a wireless set in Western Europe heard it. Winfried Heinemann, whose military study of Operation Valkyrie is the current standard work on the coup as a military operation, makes a specific point about the chateau in the Seine Valley. Army Group B headquarters learned of the assassination attempt through radio broadcasts, not through the conspiracy, through the radio, like everybody else. That is a documentary observation, and it does real work. It tells you that whatever General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, the Chief of Staff of Army Group B since April 1944, knew or suspected in advance, he was not being run as a communications node by the Bendlerstrasse on the day. Heinemann uses it to argue exactly that Speidel's involvement was peripheral. Set that against Speidel's own book, Invasion 1944, published in 1949, and you have the channel's standard problem in miniature. The memoir is a claim about what he knew. The absence of him from the signals traffic is a fact about the signals traffic. They are not the same kind of evidence, and they do not carry the same weight. Now the two headquarters begin to converge. At around 2000 hours, Kluge came back to La Roche-Guyon and immediately called a conference. Beaver's account is specific about what was already odd. Blumentritt suspected that Kluge was involved in the plot simply because there had been 2 anonymous calls for him from the Reich. One of them was from Ludwig Beck. Read that carefully because it is the single most useful sentence in the English language literature on this evening. It does not say Kluge admitted anything. It says his own chief of staff drew an inference from the switchboard. The evidence that first pointed at Kluge on the night of July 20th was not a document, not a confession, and not a witness to a conversation. It was 2 unexplained calls from Germany, logged by a headquarters that could not identify the callers. 10 minutes after Kluge walked back into the chateau, the wires produced the thing that made the question unavoidable. At 2010 hours, British interception stations picked up a signal from General Feldmarschall Erwin von Witzleben, flagged with the highest priority marking, Führer Blitz. It began, "The Führer is dead. I have been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht," and also. And then it cut off. Beaver reproduces that fragment, and the fragment is the closest thing this whole story has to a contemporaneous document, because it was recorded by a third party at the moment of transmission, by people with no stake in how the Germans later described the evening. It is also, read as an order, an announcement that the German army now had a different supreme commander, and that a field marshal senior to Kluge had taken the post. If that were true, obeying it was not treason. It was obedience. 30 minutes later, the wires took it back. At 2040 hours, Commander-in-Chief West received a signal from Supreme Command of the Armed Forces in East Prussia. Beaver gives the text. Today at midday, a despicable assassination attempt against the Führer was committed. The Führer is perfectly well. Around the same window, a teleprinter message over Keitel's name went out declaring every order issued from the Bendlerstrasse invalid, with the line that the Führer lives, in perfect health. So, inside a half hour, the chateau in the Seine Valley received 2 mutually exclusive orders, each from a field marshal, each on official channels, each addressed to it as the senior Western Command. One said the head of state was dead and the army had a new chief. The other said the head of state was alive and the first message was a criminal act. There was no third signal that told Kluge which one was real. What he did with that half hour is the 6 hours center of gravity. What Stülpnagel did with it in Paris was launch. The Paris operation is the part of a July 20th, 1944 that actually worked, and it is worth describing at the level of the units involved, because this was not a gesture. It was a rehearsed military seizure of a capital city's police apparatus. The executing formation was Security Regiment 1 of the 325th Security Division. That is a rear area occupation formation, not a field division, and that was the point. Its soldiers already stood guard on the buildings they were now going to enter. German reference literature identifies the regiment's commander that night as Oberstleutnant der Reserve Kurt von Krevel, and I give the name with that qualification attached. The orders came down through Boineberg-Lengsfeld as Commandant of Greater Paris, and through Linstow as Chief of Staff to the military commander. The sequence, as popular reconstructions have it, ran roughly like this. At about 21:30 hours, the trucks began moving up the Avenue Foch. At about 22:30, the operation opened, and the SS and SD premises were entered. I flag both of those times as coming from a magazine account rather than from a scholarly reconstruction of the night. What is agreed everywhere is the outcome. Not a shot was fired. The German army arrested the entire senior German police and security apparatus in occupied France, in its own offices, in a single evening without resistance. The 2 names at the top of that police chain were the higher SS and police leader in France, Karl Oberg, who had held the post since May 5, 1942, and the commander of the security police and the SD in France, SS Standartenführer Helmut Knochen. Oberg was taken at his headquarters premises off the Boulevard Lannes. Knochen was picked up away from his office and brought to the Hotel Continental. The best-known description of Oberg's arrest comes from Wilhelm von Schramm's book on the Paris side of the coup, published in 1964 under the title Aufstand der General, The Revolt of the Generals, and available in English as Conspiracy Among Generals. Schramm built the account on interviews with participants, which is worth knowing before you repeat it. In his version, General Major Walter Bremer walked into the office and put a pistol on Oberg, who was sitting at his desk in his shirt sleeves. Oberg surrendered without resistance and instructed his own escort to hand over their weapons. Now, here's a case study in how this evening's record actually behaves, and it is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to lay out. In the Providence Sunday Journal of September 28, 1947, a German officer named Wolfram von Panwitz gave an American newspaper a detailed first-person account of arresting Oberg himself. He described being briefed by Stülpnagel on July 15th, being summoned again on July 19th and told to make the arrest at 11 the following morning, entering the office, seizing Oberg's wrist and snapping handcuffs onto him. Schramm's reconstruction does not place Panwitz there at all. The 2 accounts cannot both be right, and the newspaper version has a further problem, which is that it puts the arrest in the late morning of July 20th, hours before Berlin had produced any orders at all. What you are looking at is a 1947 newspaper interview competing with a 1964 book built on interviews with other participants, and neither one is a contemporaneous record. I lean to Schramm on the simple grounds that his timings are internally consistent with the signals traffic and the newspapers are not, but that is a judgment about 2 secondary accounts, and I want you to see me making it rather than presenting the result as settled. The total detained that night is given almost everywhere as 1,200 SS and SD personnel. I would call that the figure the literature has settled on rather than a count. It appears with the same round value in English and German reference works, which usually means everybody is drawing on one earlier source, most probably Schramm. They were held at 3 locations, the Hotel Continental in central Paris, the prison at Frasnes, and Fort de l'Est, There is one further detail from Heinemann's study that belongs here, in the same flat register as the truck movements. At the military prison at Frasnes, sandbags had already been stacked. That is what a prepared execution site looks like. The Paris group had not only planned to arrest the security apparatus, they had prepared the physical arrangements for shooting some of it. So by roughly 2300 hours, this was the position. The German police and security service in France were in army custody. Their 2 chiefs were prisoners. The capital's garrison was in the hands of officers who had just committed an act that could only be legal if the Berlin signal was true. And in Berlin, at about that same hour, the Bendler block was being overrun by a Panzer replacement brigade, and the men who had sent the signal were already under arrest inside their own headquarters. Nobody in Paris knew that yet. Stülpnagel got into a car with Hofacker and drove down the Seine to La Roche-Guyon. Every retelling of what happened at the chateau includes a dinner. The field marshal received the military commander in France and his Luftwaffe advisor, and the conversation that decided the fate of the Western coup took place partly across a table with food on it. I could not tie that dinner to a scholarly reconstruction in this research pass, so take it the way I am giving it to you, as the shape every account agrees on, rather than as a documented sequence of courses and rooms. What is documented is the state of Kluge's information when they walked in. He had the Witzleben signal, cut off in mid-sentence. He had the Supreme Command signal from East Prussia, saying the Führer was perfectly well. He had a radio broadcast an hour and a half old saying the same thing. And he had 2 unexplained telephone calls from Germany that his own chief of staff had already begun to read as evidence against him. He also had a telephone call from Ludwig Beck, the retired General Oberst the conspirators had designated as head of state. The reference literature on the plot reproduces Beck's words to him. Kluge, I now ask you clearly, do you approve of this action of ours, and do you place yourself under my orders? I want to be exact about the status of that quotation. No record of the call survives. Beck was shot in the Bendler block within hours. The wording comes down through post-war reference works, not through a document or a transcript, and the only near-contemporary confirmation that the call happened at all is Blumentrit's observation about the switchboard. So the famous sentence is a reconstruction. Treat it as one. What Kluge is reported to have said at some point in those hours is the line that has followed him ever since. Winfried Heinemann quotes it. Yes, if the swine were dead. That sentence has done an enormous amount of work in the literature on July 20th, and I want to slow down on it because it is a perfect specimen of the problem this channel keeps running into. Taken at face value, it is the whole story compressed into 8 words. It says, the field marshal's objection was not moral and not legal. It was arithmetical. A dead Hitler meant a coup that could succeed, and an oath that no longer bound anyone. A living Hitler meant a firing squad. On that reading, Kluge was not deciding whether the conspiracy was right. He was deciding whether it had worked. But there is no contemporaneous record of him saying it. It comes down through recollection, by men who were in the room and who then spent the rest of their lives either dead or explaining themselves. It is not a signal, not a diary entry, not a war diary line. It is a remembered sentence, and remembered sentences from that night were remembered by people with reasons. Compare it with the 2040 hours message. That text exists because a machine printed it. The 8 words exist because a person recalled them. Both are in every account. They are not the same class of evidence, and the difference is not a technicality. The same discipline applies to how historians describe the man rather than the evidence. Ian Kershaw, in his account of the plot, writes that Kluge vacillated as ever. That is a characterization, and Kershaw is entitled to it. It is not a fact about July 20th. It is a summary judgment about a career offered by a historian, and it belongs in a different column from the 2010 and 2040 hours signals. I am naming it here precisely because it gets quoted as though it were a finding. What happened next is not in dispute in outline. Stülpnagel told Kluge what had been done in Paris. Whatever Kluge had been willing to consider while the outcome in East Prussia was uncertain, he was not willing to consider it now. He refused to place himself under Beck's orders. He refused to move against the regime, and he refused to open contact with the Allied commanders in Normandy, which was the thing Hofacker had come to ask for on July 9th, and which was the only action that would have made the Western coup mean anything operationally. Then he did 2 things in sequence, and the sequence is the point. First, he told Stülpnagel to save himself. Heinemann records the advice, change into civilian clothes, and disappear somewhere. The personnel record kept in the German reference literature notes that Stülpnagel refused. He was the military commander in France. He had ordered 1,200 arrests a few hours earlier, and there were sandbags stacked at Frasnes. He was not going to put on a suit. Second, Kluge issued the order that ended the coup in Western Europe. Beaver states it plainly. Kluge rapidly ordered Stülpnagel to release all the Gestapo and SS officers who had been arrested in Paris. That is the decision. Not a speech, not a refusal, not a moral position. An administrative instruction given by the senior soldier in the theater to a subordinate, restoring the security apparatus of the German occupation to its offices within a few hours of its removal. And then, at 01:25 hours on the morning of July 21st, Beaver records one more order out of La Roche-Guyon. Kluge ordered the arrest of Stülpnagel. I want to flag that time properly, because it is the single most consequential figure in this script, and I found it in one place. Beaver gives it. I have not been able to confirm it against a second account, and other versions of the evening describe not an arrest, but a relief from post and a summons to Berlin. There is a second problem in the sequence, and I would rather hand it to you than tidy it away. Beaver's text has Kluge order the release of the prisoners immediately on receiving the 2040 hours confirmation. The Paris accounts have the arrests still being carried out around 22:30 hours. Both cannot be right as written. Either the release order came later in the evening, after Stülpnagel had arrived and admitted what he had done, or the Paris timings are too late. I lean to the first, because a release order at 20:45 hours would have been an order to release men who had not yet been taken. What survives in every version is the order of events, rather than the clock. The prisoners came out before the man who had put them in went down. So this is the pivot, and it is the right place to stop the clock and ask what the 6 hours were actually made of. Not what kind of man Kluge was, what inputs he had, what each one was worth, and what the structure of his position permitted. Start with the signals, because they are the only hard evidence in the file. He received 2 orders from 2 field marshals inside about half an hour, and each one made the other a capital crime. The Witzleben signal was cut off mid-sentence, which is the worst possible condition for an order that asks a theater commander to change sides. The Supreme Command signal was complete, unambiguous, and consistent with a radio broadcast he could verify independently. If you are asking which message a professional staff would have judged more reliable on internal evidence alone, it is not close. The complete message beat the fragment. Second, the command structure. Because Rommel had been strafed 3 days earlier, there was no other field marshal in the West. Every account of the conspiracy's Western planning assumed 2 men at the top, one of whom might carry the other. That assumption died on a road near Sainte-Foy de Montgomery on July 17th. By July 20th, the conspirators needed a unanimous decision from a committee of 1, taken by a man who had been in the theater for about a fortnight, and who had inherited the fighting command 3 days before. Third, and this is where I have to bring in something the audience deserves to have on the table. Kluge had taken Hitler's money. On October 30th, 1942, his 60th birthday, Kluge received a payment from Hitler out of the state's funds. Gerd Überscheier and Winfried Vogel, in their study of Hitler's gifts to his elites, published in 1999 under the title Dienen und Verdienen, give the figure as 250,000 Reichsmark. John Wheeler Bennett, in The Nemesis of Power, published in 1953, gives a check for 500,000 Reichsmark, together with permission to bill the Treasury for improvements to his estate. Those 2 figures differ by a factor of 2, and I am not able to close the gap. Norman Goda's article Black Marks, published in the Journal of Modern History in the year 2000, is the study that established how the mechanism worked, a standing account inside the state's finances from which senior officers drew regular sums. Here is what I think that does and does not explain, and I want to be careful, because this is the point at which a channel like this one usually stops doing history and starts doing character assessment. It does not explain the 6 hours. A man who has taken a large sum from a head of state is not thereby prevented from moving against him, and Kluge's own record shows it. Henning von Tresckow, his chief of staff at Army Group Center, spent the better part of 2 years working on him. In November 1942, after Tresckow's pressure, Kluge met Karl Friedrich Goerdeler and undertook to arrest Hitler on the next visit to the Eastern Front. He then reversed that undertaking. That is a documented pattern of commitment followed by withdrawal, and it predates July 1944 by 20 months. The payments are part of the environment he made those decisions in, not a lever that produced them. What the payments do explain is the risk calculus. Goda's work establishes that the sums were not one-off honors, but a continuing relationship with the state's finances. And a continuing relationship is a thing that can be ended. On the evening of July 20th, the men in the Bendler block were asking a 61-year-old field marshal to stake a career, a pension, an estate, and a family standing on the accuracy of a truncated teleprinter message sent from an office block in Berlin. That is the transaction, stated without adjectives. He declined it, and he declined it after the completed message arrived rather than before. And there is one more input, which the popular accounts never weigh properly. Johannes Hürter's work on the German commanders in the East, Hitler's Heerführer, is the scholarship that reconstructed how men at Kluge's level actually made decisions inside that system, and it consistently shows the same thing. These were not men choosing between resistance and complicity in the abstract. They were men whose entire professional apparatus, staff, signals, subordinates, and legal authority existed only so long as the chain of command above them was intact. Kluge did not have a private capacity in which to act. Everything he could do, he could only do as Commander-in-Chief West. And Commander-in-Chief West was a post that existed at Hitler's pleasure, which is why the coup in the West did not fail at the chateau. It failed the moment its plan required a man to use an institution against the only thing holding the institution together. There's an operational contrast buried in this evening that almost nobody draws out, and it is the reason the two men could not meet each other halfway. Judged strictly as a military operation, the Paris action was a success. It had a defined objective, the neutralization of a hostile organization inside a friendly rear area. It had a force allocated to it that was already in position, a rear area security regiment standing guard on the very buildings it was ordered to enter. It had a target list of addresses. It had holding facilities designated in advance across 3 sites. And it had the physical preparations at the military prison already made. It achieved surprise. It took the entire enemy leadership. It was finished inside the night, and it produced no casualties on either side. Staff colleges teach worse operations than that. It also had one characteristic that made it useless. It was completely reversible. Everything Security Regiment 1 did between the trucks moving in midnight could be undone by a single instruction from a superior headquarters, and was. The prisoners went back to their desks. The commandant of Greater Paris explained the whole thing away to the SS as an exercise, and it worked, which tells you how thin the line between a coup and a drill looked from the outside that night. Kluge's instrument was the opposite in every respect. Army Group B was in contact with the Allied armies in Normandy. Along a front, it was steadily losing. It could not be pointed at anything except the enemy in front of it, and it could not be turned around, redeployed, or lent to a political operation without every subordinate headquarters, every supply column, and every divisional staff immediately understanding what was happening. There was no version of using it that could be explained away as an exercise the following morning. An occupation administration can seize a city and hand it back. An army group in battle cannot rehearse treason. That is Symmetry runs straight into the coup's Western planning. What the conspirators needed from the West was not troops. It was a name and a radio transmitter, a field marshal, who would announce that the fighting in Normandy was over and open contact with the Allied commanders. That was the request Hoffacker carried to the chateau on July 9th, and it was the request Stülpnagel came to press on the night of the 20th. It required Kluge to end a battle unilaterally on the strength of a truncated signal while the front was still being held. Martin Blumenson's judgment in Breakout and Pursuit is worth quoting for its flatness. Few officers in the Western theater were implicated, and the conspiracy had, in the official history's phrasing, virtually no effect on the military situation in the West. Soldiers at the front remained concerned with staying alive. That is an American official historian, writing with the captured German records in front of him, recording that the most dramatic night in the German command in the West did not move the line by a yard. Both readings are true at once, and that is the whole point of putting these two men side by side. The operation that worked changed nothing because it could be reversed. The decision that could have changed something was never taken, and within 6 weeks, both men who spent that evening arguing about it were dead. The aftermath divides cleanly, and the ledger is worth reading in full, because the people who came out of it best are not the ones you would guess. Stülpnagel was summoned east. He was ordered to report to the Supreme Command in Germany, and he drove. Somewhere on the old 1914 to 1918 battlefield ground near Verdun, he stopped the car, shot himself, and did not die. The bullet blinded him. He was recovered, hospitalized, and taken by the Gestapo. He was reported to have said Rommel's name while semi-conscious, and that report is thin, so treat it as a report. On August 30th, 1944, he was tried before the Volksgerichtshof under Roland Freisler and hanged at Plötzensee the same day. The drive itself and what he did at the river are a separate story, and they are covered elsewhere. Oberst Hans Ottfried von Linstow, who had passed the arrest orders down the chain in Paris, was taken on July 23rd. He was tried and hanged on the same day as his commander. Oberstleutnant Caesar von Hoffacker, who had put the coup's chances at 10% and had carried the request to the chateau twice, was arrested on July 26th. He was held far longer than the others, interrogated, tried, and hanged at Plötzensee on December 20th, 1944, 5 months after the night in Paris. General Lieutenant Hans Freiherr von Boineburg-Lengsfeld, who had run the seizure of the city as Commandant of Greater Paris, was never charged. German reference accounts credit that to Stülpnagel's silence under interrogation and to Speidel's protection. Speidel himself was arrested on September 7, 1944. He went before a Wehrmacht court of honor rather than the Volksgerichtshof, and the court's finding on him was not guilty but not free from suspicion, which spared him the People's Court and therefore his life. He survived the war. In 1949, he published Invasion 1944, and from April 1957 to September 1963, he served as commander of Allied land forces Central Europe, with his headquarters at Fontainebleau, holding a NATO command in the country he had helped administer as an occupier. Karl Oberg and Helmut Nocken, who had spent part of that night as prisoners of the German army, went back to work. Oberg held the post of higher SS and police leader in France until November 28, 1944. Both men were eventually tried by the French. Both were sentenced to death in October 1954. Both had their sentences commuted to life in April 1958, reduced to 20 years at hard labor in December 1959, and both were pardoned by Charles de Gaulle and released on November 28, 1962. Set those two paragraphs against each other, and the arithmetic of that night looks different. The officers who took the prisoners were hanged within 5 months. The prisoners were freed inside 19 years. As for Kluge, the order removing him from command was signed on August 16, 1944, and took effect the following day, when Field Marshal Walter Model took over both of his posts. He died on August 19th, on the road back to Germany. That is another script. One more thing needs saying about the evidence base for all of this, because it governs how much confidence any of it can carry. Most of what is known in detail about who said what in Paris and at the chateau comes from two bodies of material. The first is the Reich Security Main Office's own investigation, the reports compiled for Martin Bormann and Hitler on the progress of the inquiry, which were published in a documentary edition under the title Spiegelbild einer Verschwörung, Mirror Image of a Conspiracy, edited by Hans Adolf Jakobsen. Those reports are contemporaneous, detailed, and internally consistent. They are also the product of interrogation by an organization that had just been arrested by the men it was interrogating, working on prisoners under torture, for readers who wanted a particular shape of answer. Every name in them was extracted. The second is the post-war recollection of the survivors, gathered up in Wilhelm von Schramm's book and in the memoir literature, written by men who had spent the intervening years deciding what they had been. Peter Hoffmann's history of the German resistance and Joachim Fest's account of the plot are both built on those two bodies, and both are careful about it. Neither has a third source available, because the third source would have to be a record of the conversations, and there isn't one. That is why the Times survive better than the words. A teleprinter leaves a text, a dinner table does not, which leaves the structural question, and this is not only about Kluge. The Valkyrie plan ran through the replacement army chain of command, the home-based organization that controlled training units, depots, and garrison troops inside the Reich and the occupied territories. That chain could put soldiers on the streets of Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and Paris on its own signature. What it could not do was give an order to a field command. Army Group B did not answer to the Bendelstrasse, never had, so every fighting theater in the plan was a node that could only be activated by the personal assent of the officer sitting in it, not by an order, by a decision. That is a design with a single point of failure repeated at every node, and it was not an oversight, because there was no alternative available. There was no committee, no council of field marshals, no lateral channel by which two theater commanders could agree on anything without going up and back down through the Supreme Command. The German High Command had been deliberately organized so that senior officers dealt with Hitler individually and not with each other. That is the pattern, and it holds beyond July 1944. It is the same structure that let Hitler relieve Rundstedt over a telephone remark and Geyer von Schweppenberg over a critical report inside 3 days of each other, with no possibility of the two of them combining. It is the same structure that put two theater-level appointments into one man's hands on July 17th, because there was nobody else to give the second one to. And it is the same structure that made the payments possible, because a private financial relationship between a head of state and an individual field marshal only works if field marshals do not compare notes. The conspirators in Berlin understood the problem. Their answer was to produce a signal announcing that the structure had changed at the top, on the assumption that the men underneath would follow the paper. On the evening of July 20th, the paper arrived incomplete, and 30 minutes later a complete piece of paper arrived saying the opposite. Here is what the record holds, and the useful thing is not the list. It is the sorting. The first pile is machine product. 2 signals 30 minutes apart saying opposite things, each with a time attached because a receiving station wrote one down. A radio bulletin with a start and a finish, a teleprinter cue with a known running time. Nobody had to remember any of it, nobody composed any of it for posterity, and none of it was shaped by what happened afterwards. The second pile is institutional product. The order releasing the men taken in Paris. The order concerning Stülpnagel himself, which Beaver calls an arrest, and other accounts call a relief from post. The detention figure. The court dates and the executions at Plötzensee. These were generated by organizations doing routine work, and they are dependable about what was done and silent about why. The third pile is interrogation product, and it is the largest single body of detail we have on the Paris night. It is also the pile assembled by the security service that had spent part of that evening locked in the Hotel Continental, working on prisoners who had every reason to say what would end the session, for readers in Berlin who had already decided what the answer was. The fourth pile is recollection, written down years later by the men who survived, at a moment when what they had done in the summer of 1944 determined what happened to them next. Nearly everything memorable about this evening comes from the third and fourth piles. Every time, every signal text and every dated order comes from the first and second. The dinner is in the fourth pile. The line about the swine is in the fourth pile. What is not in any pile is a transcript. And a transcript is the only thing that would settle what a field marshal decided, and when, in the 6 hours between a fragment of a message and an order, out of a chateau in the Seine Valley. I have kept the piles separate for you throughout, because the moment they get mixed, the story becomes much better and much less true. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for the western half of July 20th rather than the Berlin half. If your father or grandfather came ashore in Normandy and fought against Army Group B in the weeks after this night, I'd like to hear about it. That's what the record shows. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.